Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. This is a podcast where I read old books, sometimes fiction, sometimes non-fiction, in the most boring way I can, to try help slow your spinning mind enough for you to fall asleep in the most natural way possible. The stresses of life often follow us to bed and keep us company, but I'm here to distract you from them and help you drift away. But before you do fall asleep, if you find Sleepy Time Tales helpful and you would like to support me, to help me keep it going out to you and thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider signing up to the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support from as little as $2 a month, but the really fun stuff is at $5. There's a 7-day free trial on the $5 offer, so you can take a look and see if it suits you. And it's just very useful to help me cover costs and make this worth my while. You can also make once-off tips to the tip jar, which is linked in the show notes. It's a Ko-fi or Ko-fi, I never really know how to say it. And then you can support the show without having to do so financially, but just spreading the word. If you know someone who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just tell them where to find it. And that's enough of me rattling a can. Let's get back to learning about the construction of temples in ancient Egypt. So snuggle down, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and listen closely as I lead you down the path to sleep. We pick up this week with Manual of Egyptian Archaeology and Guide to the Study of Antiquities in Egypt by Gina. The supports are of two types, the pillar and the column. Some are cut from single blocks. Thus, the monolithic pillars of the Temple of the Sphinx, the oldest hitherto found, measure 16 feet in height by 4.5 feet in width. Monolithic columns of red granite are also found among the ruins of Alexandria, Bubastis, and Memphis, which date from the reigns of Horemheb and Ramses II, and measure some 20 to 26 feet in height. But columns and pillars are commonly built in courses, which are often unequal and irregular, like those of the walls which surround them. The great columns of Luxor are not even solid, 2/3 of the diameter being filled up with yellow cement, which has lost its strength and crumbles between the fingers. The capital of the column of Tahaka at Karnak contains 3 courses, each about 48 inches high. The last and most projecting course is made up of 26 convergent stones, which are held in place by merely the weight of the abacus. The same carelessness which we have already noted in the workmanship of the walls is found in the workmanship of the columns. The quadrangular pillar, with parallel or slightly inclined sides, and generally without either base or capital, frequently occurs in tombs of the ancient empires. It reappears later at Medinet Habu in the temple of Thutmose III, and again at Karnak in what is known as the processional hall. The sides of these square pillars are often covered with painted scenes, while the front faces were more decoratively treated, being sculptured with lotus or papyrus stems in high relief, as on the pillar stelae of Karnak, or adorned with a head of Hathor crowned with a sistrum, as in the small speos of Abu Simbel, or sculptured with a full-length standing figure of Osiris, as in the second court of Medinet Habu, or as at Dendera or Gebel Barkal, with a figure of the god Bes. At Karnak, in an edifice which was probably erected by Horemheb, with building material taken from the ruins of a sanctuary of Amenhotep II and III, the pillar is capped by cornice, separated from the architrave by a thin abacus. By cutting away its 4 edges, the square pillar becomes an octagonal prism, and further, by cutting off 8 new edges, it becomes a 16-sided prism. Some pillars in the tombs of Aswan and Beni Hassan, and in the processional hall at Karnak, as well as in the chapels of Deir el-Bahari, are of this type. Besides the forms thus regularly evolved, there are others of irregular derivation, with 6, 12, 15, or 20 sides, or verging almost upon a perfect circle. The portico pillars of the Temple of Osiris at Abydos come last in the series. The drum is curved, but not round, the curve being interrupted at both extremities of the same diameter by a flat stripe. More frequently, the sides are slightly channeled, and sometimes, as at Kabbaleshe, the flutings are divided into 4 groups of 5 each, by 4 vertical flat stripes. The polygonal pillar has always a large, shallow plinth, in the form of a rounded disc. At Al-Kab, it bears the head of Hathor, sculptured in relief upon the front, but almost everywhere else it is crowned with a simple square abacus, which joins it to the architrave. Thus treated, it bears a certain family likeness to the Doric column, and one understands how Jamad and Champollion, in the first ardor of discovery, were tempted to give it the scarcely justifiable name of Proto-Doric. The column does not rest immediately upon the soil. It is always furnished with a base like that of the polygonal pillar, sometimes square with the ground, and sometimes slightly rounded. This base is either plain or ornamented only with a line of hieroglyphs. The principal forms fall into 3 types. 1. The column with campaniform or lotus flower capital. 2. The column with lotus bud capital. Or 3. The column with Hathor head capital. 1. Columns with campaniform capitals. The shaft is generally plain or merely engraved with inscriptions or bas-reliefs. Sometimes, however, as at Medamot, it is formed of 6 large and 6 small colonnettes in alternation. In pharaonic times, it is bulbous, being curved inward at the base, and ornamented with triangles one within another, imitating the large leaves which sheath the sprouting plant. The curve is so regulated that the diameter at the base and the top shall be about equal. In the Ptolemaic period, the bulb often disappears, owing probably to Greek influences. The columns which surround the first court at Edfu rise straight from their plinths. The shaft always tapers towards the top. It is finished by 3 or 5 flat bands, one above the other. At Medamot, where the shaft is clustered, the architect has doubtless thought that one tie at the top appeared insufficient to hold in a dozen colonnettes. He has therefore marked 2 other rings of bands at regular intervals. The campaniform capital is decorated from the spring of the curve with a row of leaves, like those which sheath the base. Between these are figured shoots of lotus and papyrus in flower and bud. The height of the capital and the extent of its projection beyond the line of the shaft varied with the taste of the architect. At Luxor, the campaniform capitals are 11.5 feet in diameter at the neck, 18 feet in diameter at the top, and 11.5 feet in height. At Karnak, in the hypostyle hall, the height of the capital is 12.25 feet, and the greatest diameter 21 feet. A square die surmounts the whole. This die is almost hidden by the curve of the capital, though occasionally, as at Dendera, it is higher and bears on each face a figure of the god Bes. The column with campaniform capital is mostly employed in the middle avenue of hypostyle halls, as at Karnak, the Ramesseum, and Luxor. But it was not restricted to this position, for we also find it in porticos, as at Medinet Habu, Edfu, and Pile. The processional hall of Thotmes III at Karnak contains one most curious variety. The flower is inverted like a bell and the shaft is turned upside down, the smaller end being sunk in the plinth, while the larger is fitted to the wide part of the overturned bell. This ungraceful innovation achieved no success, and is found nowhere else. Other novelties were happier, especially those which enabled the artist to introduce decorative elements taken from the flora of the country. In the earlier examples at Soleb, Sesebe, Bubastis, and Memphis, we find a crown of palm branches springing from the band, their heads being curved beneath the weight of the abacus. Later on, as we approach the Ptolemaic period, the date and the half-unfolded lotus were added to the palm branches. Under the Ptolemies and the Caesars, the capital became a complete basket of flowers and leaves, ranged row upon row, and painted in the brightest colors. Ad edfu ombos and pille, one would fancy that the designer had vowed never to repeat the same pattern in the same portico. 2. Columns with lotus bud capitals. Originally, these may perhaps have represented a bunch of lotus plants, the buds being bound together at the neck to form the capital. The columns of Beni Hassan consist of 4 rounded stems. Those of the labyrinth of the processional hall, each of Thotmes III and of Medamot, consist of 8 stems, each presenting a sharp edge on the outer side. The bottom of the column is bulbous and set round with triangular leaves. The top is surrounded by 3 or 5 bands. A moulding composed of groups of 3 vertical stripes hangs like a fringe from the lowest band in the space between every 2 stems. So varied a surface does not admit of hieroglyphic decoration. Therefore the projections were by degrees suppressed, and the whole shaft was made smooth. In the hypostyle hall at Gurney, the shaft is divided into 3 parts, the middle one being smooth and covered with sculptures, while the upper and lower divisions are formed of clustered stems. In the temple of Khonsu, in the aisles of the hypostyle hall of Karnak, and in the portico of Medinet Habu, the shaft is quite smooth, the fringe alone being retained below the top bands, while a slight ridge between each of the 3 bands recalls the original stems. The capital underwent a like process of degradation. At Beni Hassan, it is finely clustered throughout its height. In the processional hall of Thotmes III at Luxor and at Medamot, a circle of small pointed leaves and channelings around the base lessens the effect and reduces it to a mere grooved and truncated cone. In the hypostyle hall of Karnak, at Abydos, at the Ramesseum, and at Medinet Habu, various other ornaments, as triangular leaves, hieroglyphic inscriptions, or bands of cartouches flanked by urae, fill the space thus unfortunately obtained. Neither is the abacus hidden as in the campaniform capital, but stands out boldly and displays the cartouche of the royal founder. 3. Columns with Hathor-headed capitals. We find examples of the Hathor-headed column dating from ancient times, as at Deir el-Bahari, but this order is best known in buildings of the Ptolemaic period, as at Contra Latopolis, Philae, and Dendera. The shaft and the base present no special characteristics. They resemble those of the campaniform columns. The capital is in 2 divisions. Below we have a square block, bearing on each face a woman's head in high relief, and crowned with a naos. The woman has the ears of a heifer. Her hair, confined over the brow by 3 vertical bands, falls behind the ears and hangs long on the shoulders. Each head supports a fluted cornice on which stands a naos, framed between 2 volutes and crowned by a slender abacus. Thus each column has for its capital 4 heads of Hathor. Seen from a distance, as it at once recalls the form of the sistrum, so frequently represented in the bas-reliefs as held in the hands of queens and goddesses. It is in fact a sistrum, in which the regular proportions of the parts are disregarded. The handle is gigantic, while the upper part of the instrument is unduly reduced. This notion so pleased the Egyptian fancy that architects did not hesitate to combine the sistrum design with elements borrowed from other orders. The 4 heads of Hathor placed above a campaniform capital furnished Nectanebo with a composite type for his pavilion at Philae. I cannot say that the compound is very satisfactory, but the column is in reality less ugly than it appears in engravings. Shafts of columns were regulated by no fixed rules of proportion or arrangement. The architect might, if he chose, make use of equal heights with very different diameters, and regardless of any considerations apart from those of general harmony, might design the various parts according to whatever scale best suits him. The dimensions of the capital had no invariable connection with those of the shaft, nor was the height of the shaft dependent on the diameter of the column. At Karnak, the campaniform columns of the hypostyle hall measure 10 feet high in the capital and 50 feet high in the shaft, with a lower diameter of 11 feet 8 inches. At Luxor, the capital measures 11.5 feet, the shaft 49 feet, and the diameter at the spring of the base 11.25 feet. At the Ramesseum, the shaft and capital measure 35 feet, and the spring diameter is 6.5 feet. The lotus bud or clustered column gives similar results. At Karnak in the aisles of the hypostyle hall, the capital is 10 feet high, the shaft 33 feet, and the base diameter 6.75 feet. At the Ramesseum, the capital is 5.5 feet high, the shaft 24.5 feet, and the base diameter 6 feet 10 inches. We find the same irregularity as to architraves. Their height is determined only by the taste of the architect or the necessities of the building, so long with the spacing of columns. Not only does the intercolumnar space vary considerably between temple and temple, or chamber and chamber, but sometimes, as in the first court at Medinet Habu, they vary in the same portico. We have thus far treated separately of each type, but when various types were associated in a single building, no fixed relative proportions were observed. In the hypostyle hall at Karnak, the campaniform columns support the nave, while the lotus bud variety is relegated to the aisles. There are halls in the temple of Khonsu where the lotus bud column is the loftiest, and others where the campaniform dominates the rest. In what remains of the Medamot structure, campaniform and lotus bud columns are of equal height. Egypt had no definite orders like those of Greece, but tried every combination to which the elements of the column could be made to lend themselves. Hence we can never determine the dimensions of an Egyptian column from those of one of its parts. 2. The Temple. Most of the famous sanctuaries, Dendera, Edfu, Abydos, were founded by the servants of Hor. Becoming dilapidated or ruined in the course of ages, they have been restored, rebuilt, remodeled, one after the other, till nothing remains of the primitive design to show us what the first Egyptian architecture was like. The funerary temples built by the kings of the 4th dynasty have left some traces. That of the second pyramid of Gizeh was so far preserved at the beginning of the last century that Melet saw 4 large pillars standing. It is now almost entirely destroyed, but this loss has been more than compensated by the discovery, in 1853, of a temple situated about 50 yards to the southward of the Sphinx. The facade is still hidden by the sand, and the inside is but partly uncovered. The core masonry is of fine Tura limestone. The casing, pillars, architraves, and roof were constructed with immense blocks of alabaster or red granite. The plan is most simple. In the middle, A, is a great hall in the shape of the letter T, adorned with 16 square pillars, 16 feet in height. At the northwest corner of this hall is a narrow passage on an inclined plane, by which the building is now entered. At the southwest corner is a recess which contains 6 niches, in pairs one over the other. A long gallery opening at each end into a square chamber, now filled with rubbish, completes the plan. Without any main door, without windows, and entered through a passage too long to admit the light of day, the building can only have received light and air through slanting air slits in the roofing, of which traces are yet visible on the tops of the walls on each side of the main hall. Inscriptions, bas-reliefs, paintings, such as we are accustomed to finding everywhere in Egypt, are all wanting. And yet these bare walls produce as great an impression upon the spectator as the most richly decorated temples of Thebes. Not only grandeur but sublimity has been achieved in the mere juxtaposition of blocks of granite and alabaster, by means of purity of line and exactness of proportion. Some few scattered ruins in Nubia, the Fayum, and Sinai do not suffice to prove whether the temples of the 12th dynasty merited the praises lavished on them in contemporary inscriptions or not. Those of the Theban kings, of the Ptolemies, and of the Caesars, which are yet standing, are in some cases nearly perfect, while almost all are easy of restoration to those who conscientiously study them upon the spot. At first sight they seem to present an infinite variety as to arrangement, but on a closer view they are found to conform to a single type. We will begin with the sanctuary. This is a low, small, obscure, rectangular chamber, inaccessible to all save Pharaoh and the priests. As a rule, it contained neither statue nor emblem, but only the sacred bark, or a tabernacle of painted wood placed upon a pedestal. A niche in the wall or an isolated shrine formed of a single block of stone received on certain days the statue or inanimate symbol of the local god, or the living animal, or the image of the animal sacred to that god. A temple must necessarily contain this one chamber, and if it contained but this one chamber, it would be no less a temple than the most complex buildings. Very rarely, however, especially in large towns, was the service of the gods thus limited to the strictly necessary. Around the sanctuary or divine house was grouped a series of chambers in which sacrificial and ceremonial objects were stored, as flowers, perfumes, stuffs, and precious vessels. In advance of this block of buildings were next built one or more halls supported on columns, and in advance of these came a courtyard where the priests and devotees assembled. This courtyard was surrounded by a colonnade to which the public had access, and was entered through a gateway flanked by two towers, in front of which were placed statues or obelisks, the whole being surrounded by an enclosure wall of brickwork and approached through an avenue of sphinxes. Every pharaoh was free to erect a hall still more sumptuous in front of those which his predecessors had built, and what he did, others might do after him. Thus successive series of chambers and courts, of pylons and porticos, were added reign after reign to the original nucleus. And, vanity or piety prompting the work, the temple continued to increase in every direction, till space or means had failed. The most simple temples were sometimes the most beautiful. This was the case as regards the sanctuaries erected by Amenhotep III in the island of Elephantine, which were figured by the members of the French expedition at the end of the last century, and destroyed by the Turkish governor of Aswan in 1822. The best preserved, namely the South Temple, consisted of but a single chamber of sandstone, 14 feet high, 31 feet wide, and 39 feet long. The walls, which were straight and crowned with the usual cornice, rested on a platform of masonry some 8 feet above the ground. This platform was surrounded by a parapet wall, breast high. All around the temple ran a colonnade, the sides each consisting of 7 square pillars without capital or base, and the 2 facades, front and back, being supported by 2 columns with the lotus bud capital. Both pillars and columns rose direct from the parapet, except on the east front, where a flight of 10 or 12 steps enclosed between 2 walls of the same height as the platform led up to the cellar. The columns at the head of the steps were wider apart than those of the opposite face, and through the space thus opened was seen a richly decorated door. A second door opened at the other end beneath the portico. Later in Roman times, this feature was utilized in altering the building. The intercolumnar space at the end was filled up, and thus was obtained a second hall, rough and bare, but useful for the purposes of the temple service. These Elephantine sanctuaries bring to mind the peripteral temples of the Greeks, and this resemblance to one of the most familiar forms of classical architecture explains perhaps the boundless admiration with which they were regarded by the French savants. Those of Mashik, of El-Kab, and of Sharona are somewhat more elaborate. The building at El-Kab is in 3 divisions. First, a hall of 4 columns. Next, a chamber, supported by 4 Hathor-headed pillars. And in the end wall opposite the door, a niche, approached by 4 steps. Of these small oratories, the most complete model now remaining belongs to the Ptolemaic period, namely, the Temple of Hathor at Deir el-Medineh. Its length is just double its breadth. The walls are built with a batter inclining inwards, and are externally bare, save at the door, which is framed in a projected border covered with finely sculptured scenes. The interior is in 3 parts: a portico supported by 2 lotus flower columns, a pronaos reached by a flight of 4 steps and separated from the portico by a wall, which connects the 2 lotus flower columns with 2 Hathor-headed pilasters in antis. Lastly, the sanctuary, flanked by 2 small chambers, which are lighted by square openings cut in the ceiling. The ascent to the terrace is by way of a staircase, very ingeniously placed in the south corner of the portico, and furnished with a beautiful open window. This is merely a temple in miniature, but the parts, though small, are so well proportioned that it would be impossible to conceive anything more delicate or graceful. We cannot say as much for the temple which the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty erected to the south of Karnak, in honor of the god Khonsu. But if the style is not irreproachable, the plan is nevertheless so clear that one is tempted to accept it as the type of an Egyptian temple, in preference to others more elegant or majestic. On analysis, it resolves itself into 2 parts separated by a thick wall. In the center of the lesser division is the Holy of Holies, open at both ends and isolated from the rest of the building by a surrounding passage, 10 feet in width. To the right and left of this sanctuary are small dark chambers, and behind it is a hall of 4 columns, from which open 7 other chambers. Such was the house of the god, having no communication with the adjoining parts, except by 2 doors in the southern wall. These opened into a wide and shallow hypostyle hall, divided into nave and aisles. The nave is supported by 4 lotus flower columns, 23 feet in height. The aisles each contain 2 lotus bud columns, 18 feet in height. The roof of the nave is therefore 5 feet higher than that of the sides. This elevation was made use of for lighting purposes, the clerestory being filled with stone gratings which admitted the daylight. The court was square and surrounded by a double colonnade, entered by way of 4 side gates, and a great central gateway flanked by 2 quadrangular towers with sloping fronts. This pylon measures 105 feet in length, 33 feet in width, and 60 feet in height. It contains no chambers, but only a narrow staircase which leads to the top of the gate, and thence up to the towers. 4 long grooves in the facade, reaching to 1/3 of its height, correspond to 4 quadrangular openings cut through the whole thickness of the masonry. Here were fixed 4 great wooden masts formed of joint beams, and held in place by a wooden framework fixed in the 4 openings above mentioned. From these masts floated long streamers of various colors. Such was the temple of Khonsu, and such in their main features were the majority of the greater temples of Theban and Ptolemaic times, as Luxor and Ramesseum, Medinet Habu, Edfu, and Dendera. Though for the most part half in ruins, they affect one with a strange and disquieting sense of oppression. As mystery was a favorite attribute of the Egyptian gods, even so the plan of their temples is in such wise devised as to lead gradually from full sunshine of the outer world to the obscurity of their retreats. At the entrance we find large open spaces where air and light stream freely in. The hypostyle hall is pervaded by a sober twilight. The sanctuary is more than half lost in a vague darkness, and at the end of the building, in the furthest of the chambers, night all but reigns completely. The effective distance which was produced by this gradual diminution of light was still further heightened by various structural artifices. The parts, for instance, are not on the same level. The ground rises from the entrance, and there are always a few steps to mount in passing from one part to another. In the temple of Khonsu, the difference of level is not more than 5¼ feet, but it is combined with a lowering of the roof, which in most cases is very strongly marked. From the pylon to the wall at the farther height, the height decreases continuously. The peristyle is loftier than the hypostyle hall, and the hypostyle hall is loftier than the sanctuary. The last hall of columns in the farthest chamber are lower and lower still. The architects of Ptolemaic times changed certain details of arrangement. They erected chapels and oratories on the terraced roofs, and reserved space for the construction of secret passages and crypts in the thickness of the walls, wherein to hide the treasure of the god. They, however, introduced only 2 important modifications of the original plan. The sanctuary was formerly entered by 2 opposite doors. They left but one. Also the colonnade, which was originally continued round the upper end of the court, or where there was no court, along the facade of the temple, became now the pronaos, so forming an additional chamber. The columns of the outer row are retained, but building into a wall reaching to about half their height. This connecting wall is surmounted by a cornice, which thus forms a screen, and so prevented the outer throng from seeing what took place within. The pronaos is supported by 2, 3, or even 4 rows of columns, according to the size of the edifice. For the rest, it is useful to compare the plan of the temple of Edfu with that of the temple of Khonshu, observing how little they differ the one from the other. Thus designed, the building sufficed for all the needs of worship. If enlargement was needed, the sanctuary and surrounding chambers were generally left untouched, and only the ceremonial parts of the building, as the hypostyle halls, the courts, or pylons, were attacked. The procedure of the Egyptians under these circumstances is best illustrated by the history of the great temple of Karnak. Founded by Urtetsin I, probably on the site of a still earlier temple, it was but a small building, constructed of limestone and sandstone with granite doorways. The inside was decorated with 16-sided pillars. The second and third Amenhotps added some work to it, and the princes of the 13th and 14th dynasties adorned it with statues and tables of offerings. It was still unaltered when, in the 18th century BC, Thutmose I, enriched with booty of war, resolved to enlarge it. In advance of what already stood there, he erected 2 chambers, preceded by a court and flanked by 2 isolated chapels. In advance of these again, he erected 3 successive pylons, one behind the other. The whole presented the appearance of a vast rectangle, placed crosswise at the end of another rectangle. Thutmose II and Hatshepsut covered the walls erected by their father with bas-relief sculptures, but added no more buildings. Hatshepsut, however, in order to bring in her obelisks between the pylons of Thutmose I, opened a breach in the south wall, and overthrew 16 of the columns which stood in that spot. Thutmose III, probably finding certain parts of the structure unworthy of the god, rebuilt the first pylon, and also the double sanctuary, which he renewed in the red granite of Syene. To the eastward he rebuilt some old chambers, the most important among them being the processional hall, used for the starting point and halting place of ceremonial processions, and these he surrounded with a stone wall. He also made the lake whereon the sacred boats were launched on festival days, and with a sharp change of axis he built 2 pylons facing towards the south, thus violating the true relative proportion which had till then subsisted between the body and the front of the general mass of the building. The outer enclosure was now too large for the earlier pylons, and did not properly accord with the later ones. Amenhotep III corrected this deficit, he erected a sixth and yet more massive pylon, which was therefore better suited for the facade. As it now stood, the temple surpassed even the boldest architectural enterprises hitherto attempted. But the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty succeeded in achieving still more. They added only a hypostyle hall and a pylon, but the hypostyle hall measured 170 feet in length by 329 feet in breadth. Down the center they carried a main avenue of 12 columns with lotus flower capitals, being the loftiest ever erected in the interior of a building, while in the aisles ranged in 7 rows on either side, they planted 122 columns with lotus bud capitals. The roof of the great nave rose to a height of 75 feet above the level of the ground, and the pylon stood some 50 feet higher still. During a whole century, 3 kings labored to perfect this hypostyle hall. Ramesses I conceived the idea, Seti I finished the bulk of the work, and Ramesses II wrought nearly the whole of the decoration. The pharaohs of the next following dynasties vied with each other for such blank spaces as might be found, wherein to engrave their names upon the columns, and so to share the glory of the 3 founders. But further they did not venture. Left thus, however, the monument was still incomplete. It still needed one last pylon and a colonnaded court. Nearly 3 centuries elapsed before the task was again taken in hand. At last the Bubastite kings decided to begin the colonnades, but their work was as feeble as their resources were limited. Taharqa, the Ethiopian, imagined for a moment that he was capable of rivaling the great Theban pharaohs, and planned a hypostyle hall even larger than the first, but he made a false start. The columns of the great nave, which were all that he had time to erect, were placed too wide apart to admit of being roofed over, so they never supported anything, but remained as memorials of his failure. Finally, the Ptolemies, faithful to the traditions of the native monarchy, threw themselves into the work. But their labors were interrupted by revolts at Thebes, and the earthquake of the year 27 BC destroyed part of the temple, so that the pylon remained forever unfinished. The history of Karnak is identical to that of all the great Egyptian temples. When closely studied, the reason why they are for the most part so irregular becomes evident. The general plan is practically the same, and the progress of the building was carried forward in the same way. But the architects could not always foresee the future importance of their work, and the site was not always favorable to the development of the building. And I'm gonna leave it there. As always, if you'd like to pick up where I'm leaving off, you can find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.